I was 23 when I went to tell the bees that someone in my life had died. Telling the bees about a death was a common practice in the English speaking world up until a few centuries ago, and it was a practice that I had pondered as I wrote an essay about the West's declining sense of magic in everyday life. When I got to the hive, I found it quiet and thought it was empty, so I walked back up to the house and to the car that carried me to the funeral, the news untold, and more importantly, unheard by the bees. Disenchantment is the word sociologists use to describe how the West went from a worldview infused by magic to one completely devoid of it. Part of disenchantment is driven by the horrors of modern war, typified by World War I. While it is true that World War I drained much of the magic from the modern world, it is also true that the horrors of war lit a spark that inspired the members of the literary group called the Inklings. This group sought to recover what they could of this magic. The members of this group, they included C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien.
Welcome to Quid Pros Quo, where creativity meets academia. Here, we're all about leveraging our love of academia to improve both your creative writing practice and ours. Whether you're honing your craft or just beginning your writing journey, we're here to share scholarly insights, inspiration, and advice that benefits us all. Let's get started.
Hi, welcome to Quid Pros Quo. I'm Zach.
And I'm Rin.
And today on Quid Pros Quo, we are reading Mythos to Myth to Mythopoeia, a cyclical process by Ashna Mary Jacob and Nirmala Menon. Jacob is an assistant professor at the Indian Institute of Technology. I'm going to slaughter this name, but we're going to give it a good old college try. I'm going to guess Bhubaneswar, and Menon is the professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, Indore. This paper, super interesting. It's kind of technical. I love me some technical papers, which makes sense because that's kind of my dealio. But it proposes a cyclical framework for how myths are created, incorporated into a culture, and then become irrelevant, preparing the way for new myths to be created. So let's dive into it.
So Jacob and Menon start their paper by defining 3 terms corresponding to the life cycle of a myth. Mythopoeia, in their formulation, is an attempt to give new life to myths that no one believes in anymore, which is different from the mythopoesis that we talked about in the last episode, which is the creation of new myths. Even though they're very similar words, different things. Stick with us, please. You're doing great.
Yeah, when you're reading these papers, you got to be careful about how people are using the words because they often change from paper to paper.
So, Mythopoeia is an attempt to give new life to a mythos that no one believes in anymore. Mythos is a story the community believes in that requires a literal reenactment through ceremony or worship. And myths are mythos that have lost their community. So, mythos is like the current iteration of a myth, the one that society currently believes in, whereas myths are ones that no longer have a community. So, we think of like the Greek myths or the Roman myths. Like, it's not really a very large community that believes in those gods anymore and those creation myths. Mm-hmm. So they've become myths instead of mythos.
Yeah, I really like that quote from the paper at the end of Mythos, where it's a story that a community believes in, and it also requires reenactment through ceremony. I think that is a really interesting definition that Jacob and Menon put into this framework. And I think it's kind of important to think about myths in that way, particularly because of some of the things that scholars like Karen Armstrong have written about scripture, which we're going to get into in a minute. But first, let's talk about more academics. Jacob and Menon reference Sophia Heller and William Indick in their paper. And Heller and Indick have pointed to a lack of mythos in our contemporary culture and argue that individuals create myths for themselves in order to fill the void that is left over without any mythos. Jacob and Menon make the case that writers are people who share their individual myths with other people. And this kind of goes along with something that Karen Armstrong, one of my favorite researchers, has written. She writes, quote, "It has been writers and artists rather than religious leaders who have stepped into the vacuum and attempted to reacquaint us with the mythological wisdom of the past."
Yes, which I love that quote. That is such a cool quote. I I was not familiar with it before Zach brought it into this episode, but I think that's like such a fun romantic way to look at writers, and I love it.
Yeah.
So Jacob and Menon make the case that authors fill this vacuum through Mythopoeia. Wow. Tongue twisters here. I'm trying not to say Mythopoesis, which was the one I trained myself to say for the last episode.
Yeah.
So what does this mean for authors? And like, what is Mythopoeia? To Tolkien, Mythopoeia is a 3-part process that includes borrowing in time, borrowing in space, and then invention, where invention is the most important part because it makes the whole more than the sum of its parts. And this is kind of like soup in that you have like all the veggies and the meat and like you put everything together, but then it becomes more than just some of its parts and it becomes something delicious and wonderful.
Yeah, when I was reading this, this soup metaphor going through the article, I thought it was an interesting perspective off because of kind of the way that we talk about issues around cultural appropriation inside of literature and in the arts. And I think the idea of the soup actually helps to kind of illustrate what the problem is, or when appropriation is problematic versus when appropriation is respectful, if that makes sense.
Appropriation versus appreciation, I think, is generally better words for that, I think.
Yeah. And I think one way, using the soup metaphor, to look at cultural appropriation is a failure on the part of the author to invent. It's a regurgitation. Or you could also look at it you could also look at cultural appropriation as a charged level by a critic who, in the words of Tolkien, has, quote, lost the sight of the forest for the trees. The stories need to be appreciated as they are as a whole rather than in relation to their various parts. So, Bryn, what do you think about this?
Yeah. So I don't know if I have like formed thoughts as much as questions. When we're saying that like you're making like your Mythopoeia soup and you're not inventing, you're just like regurgitating a recipe, right? And then in order to make something new, you have to put in your own twist on the dish. Is that what we're saying?
I think that's definitely one way of thinking about it, right? Is saying that there is a part of you that goes into it. That goes back to what Jacob and Menon and Armstrong are saying, is that authors are people who share their personal I suppose it would be myth walk, but they share that with people.
Yeah. Okay, that makes more sense to me. I got a little lost in the soup there. Mythopoeia, if we're good to move on, Mythopoeia also entails the creation of a secondary world which is self-contained. And this means like no point of reference in our world is needed to understand it. And obviously we're going to compare second worlds to our own world. Like we're like, oh, it's so different. And I think like a lot of people look at like the world of the Stormlight Archives in Brandon Sanderson, where like the class is not separated by like skin color, but eye color. Because skin color is a very common way we've segregated our world.
Yeah.
Wrong as it may be. And then we like Brandon Sanderson takes like eye color and he's like, light eyes are the nobility. And we're like, oh, that's so weird. Why would anyone do that? And it's just like, yeah, so you don't need that point of reference, but it is important to understand that you will take your life experiences and compare it, like what you know, to that second world and compare the second world to what you know.
Yeah. I think when I was reading through this, one of the things that kind of left me wondering is that Jacob and Menon didn't mention if the second world is necessarily a world other than our own, or if it can be something within our own world. And I think that distinction is relevant for things like, I think Harry Potter is a good example, because it's a secondary world in the sense that, you know, it's self-contained and it doesn't really interact with the Muggle world outside of it. But it also fits within our own world. So, I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of this, like, Harry Potter's one example. I think of any other number of, like, contemporary fiction where it, like, uses our world. but the events are fictional, which kind of makes a secondary world in and of itself. Like, I've been reading a lot of romance lately, like specifically Emily Henry, which is a very big name in the romance community. And
Mm-hmm.
I was like, she was like, I'm sure the town that the main character went to I'm sure all these towns are real, like, and the Lobster Festival in Maine and Happy Place is like a real thing.
Yeah.
But because of the way we create our myths, our mythopoeia, it by nature becomes a secondary world. And I think that the ambiguity that the authors don't address that you just mentioned, like whether it's in our world or out of our world,
Mm-hmm.
is like, I think they probably left that open ended on purpose, if I
Mm.
had to
Yeah, I
guess at
could
the
see that.
intentions of it. And because, yeah, like Harry Potter, like a romance novel, like Stargirl, Jerry Spinelli, like
Yeah, yeah,
these
yeah,
worlds are all in our world, but not of our world almost.
yeah.
um, yeah. So, Zach, why do you think an author would engage in Mythopoeia?
This is a really great question, and I hope that we can answer it for ourselves once we go through what Jacob and Menon write inside of their article, because I think this is really interesting. They're drawing a lot on Tolkien's work, as you probably could tell based off of all of the Tolkien quotes. But Jacob and Menon adopt kind of Tolkien's four purposes for Mythopoeia, right? The first one is recovery, which goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of the episode during the intro, is that part of the reason why we engage in myth making is to recover a sense of the magical and the fantastic inside of a world that, in the case of modern Mythopoeia, it's not our own. Like it's that secondary world, but we retain some sense of the magical because we get to observe this secondary world through literature. The second purpose that Jacob and Menon talk about from Tolkien is escape and the value of escapism when it comes to the secondary world. Being able to leave behind, stressful political situations or stressful current events and to be able to go into that secondary world. The third is consolation, which is a very Tolkien way of looking at it because Tolkien firmly believed that part of writing fantasy, particularly, was that it needed to show readers that justice is satisfied, or in other words, that evil people have punishment meted out to them and good people have their rewards shown to them. It's a very, in many respects, it's kind of like what we had with the Hays Code inside of movies during the early 20th century, where it was like, it has to be really clear that the good guys have good things happen to them and the bad people get punished.
Mm-hmm.
This is, um, when I was thinking about this, it reminded me of our last episode on Mythopoesis, where we talked about how Mythopoesis is like a striving for something higher or separate from our lived reality. And that seems to be kind of what's going on here because often in our lives, justice isn't satisfied. Bad things happen to good people and bad people get off without like a,
With like a slap
the,
on the wrist.
yes, yeah. And so I think that consolation in many respects can be that expression of longing for something, for something higher.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we also in our literature we crave a lot more complexity than we used to. At least as I've gotten older, I've noticed that in me myself.
Yeah.
Because yeah, it's fun to like it's good to have like the Disney movie where good people get good things and the villain gets punished at the end. Like the fairy tale approach, the like Disney fairy tale approach is great, but then you think of like, and maybe this is me being short sighted because I said like the fairy tale approach, but I think like Grimm's fairy tales where it was very much like told to scare children into being good, which I guess is still the same traditional thing, but still even like good bad things would happen to good people like Snow White.
Yeah.
in the Grimm's fairy tales was like sent to be killed by a hunter in a forest because she was pretty. She didn't do
Yep.
anything wrong.
Yep.
But as I've grown older, I don't want to say I've like fallen in love with like the anti-hero or the morally gray antagonist, because that's oh my god, that's like a whole other episode we could do if we can find an article on it about morally gray characters and whether or not they're actually morally gray and like amoral versus morally ambiguous. This is something I think about a lot. This is actually something I'm gonna look for our future episodes. But like every once in a while you want like a really good like ambiguous character that you like don't know if you should love them or hate them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I see where constellation comes in, and also the complexities of where sometimes you need to not satisfy justice in order to make a point in your book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think there's an interesting question there of, are we, in that case, are we still talking about myths, or are we talking about, something else? Because when it comes to literature, it's all about, okay, what can we put a name to? Because once we name it, we can talk about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The final category of like purpose of Mythopoeia, is it Mythopoeia or Mythopoeia?
I don't know. Let's just roll with what we've been doing.
Okay,
which is
great. Mythopoeia is eucatastrophe, which is a word that Tolkien invented, again, another Tolkien influence, which literally translates to good catastrophe, which is it's like another word for a miracle. It's something that can be replicated, but that inspires joy instead of disaster and despair.
Yeah. Because oftentimes catastrophe goes along with tragedy, where something happens and the hero gets their comeuppance. I think of like Oedipus, where the entire time we're kind of like biting our nails because we're like, oh, we know that this isn't going to end well, and then it doesn't, and then there's kind of like everything went terribly. But for Tolkien, and part of his formulation of how myths work, it's supposed to be, oh my goodness, that's so wonderful that everything worked out. Like it was.
It's supposed to be awe-inspiring rather than despair-inspiring.
Yeah.
And then, so we talked about this whole thing being a cycle, and the title of the article is Mythos to Myth to Mythopoeia. So how does Mythopoeia turn into Mythos?
This is a really good question, and when I was reading through this, I feel like this was kind of missing inside of the text, because I think that they talked about how how Mythopoeia gets incorporated into our communities, but they didn't really address the idea that mythos needs to be reenacted through ritual. Which is something that they set up at the very beginning of the paper. But I think that fandom is a big mechanism for this, like participating in cons, writing fan fiction, creating cosplay, doing role-playing games set inside of your favorite, settings and worlds, adaptations, spin-offs, like all of the trappings of fandom to me sound like that is how we reenact a story through ritual today, even though we're not doing, the ritual-y things that we associate with it for, fortune telling inside of ancient Greece, for example.
Yeah. I mean, and I think I love your take that fandom is the way we bring Mythopoeia into mythos, because I just think you're right about it.
I always love to hear that I'm right. That's like my favorite thing.
Yeah. Well, it just makes so much sense. And like, I think the rituals of fandom, like rewatching your favorite shows, or like,
yeah,
all these like, I don't know. I think of like my cousins are like, we've talked on the show before about how we have very mixed feelings on Harry Potter because J.K. Rowling is not very good person and like has some very problematic opinions. But it's a very big fandom and it's a great example to use in writing. Like, we can acknowledge the complexities and that justice is not always served. But, maybe justice has yet to be served. Anyways, I'm going to stop talking about JKR. But I think of, like, my cousins who keep telling me about different Harry Potter fan fictions that they love so much that, like, my cousin Mari wants, like, print out her favorite fan fictions and then bind them into a book, which you can do because you're not making, no one is making money off it, and she would never sell it, and, like, anyways, all that. But it's, like, things like that that's how you get, and I think that also, like, lends into our next question, is that's how you get, like, Mythopoeia into Mythos into myths.
Yeah.
Because eventually, like, if my cousin goes and binds that book, then eventually she's either going to pass it down to her kids if she has kids, or she's going to get left there and then it will become a myth.
Yeah, because it is no longer attached to a community. There's no person there to maintain it as part of their daily life through those rituals. And I feel like you actually pointed this out when we were talking about Lord of the Rings, where you talked about how with Lord of the Rings, it's heavily male dominated. And so in your experience, it's not as
resonant.
It's not as resonant. Yeah. And I think in some ways, thinking about how mythos turns to myth, where, these mythos lose their relevance, is an example of that, because when Lord of the Rings came out, we needed women's representation, right? We weren't thinking about it in the same ways, or to this, let's say,
same
in the same
degree.
Ways.
Yeah.
We weren't thinking about it in the same ways in, when Lord of the Rings came out versus now
in
with
the
power.
40s or 50s, right?
Yeah.
Trying to think, I don't know exactly when Lord of the Rings came out, but I'm definitely, we have said it before, I'll say it again, I'm not a Lord of the Rings super fan, and that's okay. I don't know when Lord of the Rings came out. I respect Tolkien and all he did for the genre and fantasy as a whole and all that. Like, I very much respect him for it. I just do not vibe with Lord of the Rings, and that's okay.
54.
54, okay.
54.
I mean, I love that you have it on your desk. Wow, true Lord of the Rings fan right there. Could never be me. But you say that Karen Armstrong has a better way of describing the turn from mythos to myth than Jacob and Menon do. In The Battle for God and the Lost Art of Scripture, myths frozen in time lose their relevance as times change. And I love that little, like, nugget of wisdom, because, like, I think about this a lot with, like, my dad, and my bookshelf, not my bookshelf, but one of my parents' bookshelves at home is full of my dad's old fantasy novels from, like, the 80s and 90s. And I'm sure, like, he loves them, and, like, I read a ton of them as a kid. Like, I think of, like, the Black Cauldron series, which the Black Cauldron is not the first book in the series. It's, like, the second book in the series, or the third book.
Yeah,
but, like, that series, and then there's also one, and I don't remember the name of the series. I just remember one of the books is called Gara the Sorceress, because I saw it at the used bookstore the other day, and I was like, I read that book. That book has, like, burned into my psyche. Couldn't tell you anything about it except Paul Gara was, like, really cool, and, like, probably the best, like, female representation my dad had in his, like, old fantasy literature. But, like, I look at all these old fantasy books that I'm sure had huge fandoms 40 years ago now. Oh my god, that's a long time. That's, like, twice as old as I am. Like, all these old books that had, like, fandoms, like, 40 years ago, but are now dying off because their readers have, like, forgotten the books, have not, like, managed to pass the love of these myths to their children, and are now become myths instead of mythos.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the churn that Jacob and Menon talk about, because many of the things that are in those, like, 80s, 80s and 90s era fantasy books are being, recycled sounds so like,
composted.
yeah, I don't know. It sounds reincorporated, like they're being
Yeah.
reincorporated and given new life inside of the fantasy that we produce today. And I think, kind of bringing our discussion to a close on this article, I really love the idea of how stories can move in this in this cycle where
Mhm.
we are constantly building upon the stories inside of the past, and we're bringing magic to them in the ways that speak to us. Because what speaks to us is not going to be the same thing that spoke to, the ancient Greeks. It's not going to be the same thing that spoke to, medieval peasants. But we get to put magic into these things, and we get to live that inside of our fandom. And eventually, when the time is past, it fades into myth, and then has the opportunity to be reincorporated or to be revitalized.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. And it makes me think, this is just a question I guess I'll leave with us. But like it makes you wonder like which of these fandoms will like stand the test of time, because some fandoms endure longer than others. Like Star
Mm-hmm.
Trek has had a pretty good fandom and like is consistently creating new. I think they're still making new seasons of Star Trek. I don't actually know.
There is still Star Trek
Yeah,
Star
but
Trek
there's still like a
content being
strong
made.
Star Trek fandom, and like I guess a maybe more relevant example, maybe not relevant. I don't want to say relevant; that's the wrong word. But another maybe more timely example is Star Wars, as they are continually always making more Star Wars content.
Yeah, yeah.
And it makes you wonder, like, when will this Mythopoeia become Mythos, become myth, and then
Mm-hmm.
eventually, like, people get rediscovered and become Mythos again?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know. It's like how in the Renaissance people like got
Oh,
really
that's a
back into the
really good
classics, you
example.
know?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, yeah, it's just a cool thing to think about. Do you
I
have
love
any
that.
other? Yeah, do you have any other thoughts, Zach?
No, I really want to hear from our listeners. Like, what do you think about the kinds of, which of the fandoms, which of the stories that we tell today are the ones that are going to become those, for lack of a better word, founding myths for a new generation of Mythopoeia? I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to read them. Love to chat with
Yeah.
you in the comments.
Yeah, chat with us in comments on social media or email us quidprosquo@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. We will see you next week.
Quid Pros Quo is hosted by DC Winters and CK Jensen. If you liked this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to contact us, you can email us at quidprosquo@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today.